Okay, good evening and Chodesh Tov, good Chodesh Kislev, good Shabbos also. Uh, Last year I wrote a book called 24 Days and Journey to the Awesome Light of Chanukah. And I'll explain why that this book exists, what the point of it is. We'll just read the introduction, and I'm going to try and do some of them today. And actually, I hope to do all of them for the 24 days and put them up on my site. So this will basically take care of two things at one time. And I will start by reading the introduction. The Sefer itself is available on Amazon. The PDF is available on my site, but it's now available through tonight's share. So let me just read, okay. There are 24 days between Rosh Chodesh, Kislev, and Chanukah. No big deal, right? Wrong. And not just because they lead up to Chanukah, but because they are the lead up to Chanukah, the only Jewish holiday to fall on the 25th day of a month. Every other day, every other holiday, every Chag falls either at the beginning of the month, the 15th, when we're supposed to be our strongest koyach, the full moon. Chanukah is different. The Zohar alludes to this here. It says in the Zohar, Tikkunia Zohar, the eighth sphere of Hod is the 8 days of Chanukah. It's a little Kabbalah for this, but which occurs after the 24 days of Kislev, during which the Hashmonaim battled the Greeks. They correspond to the 24 letters of Baruch Shem Kavod Machuso Le'olam Ve'ed. That's the second verse of the Shema, right? That is a very insightful connection between the first 24 days of Kislev and the second verse of the Shema, especially after knowing this. This is what the Zohar also says. Yaakov had wanted to rectify the Malchus below, besod the lower unity, and establish the unity of the 24 letters, which is Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Ve'olam Ve'ed. He did not complete it with 25 letters like the Shema, since the Mishkan had yet to be built. We don't know at this moment in time exactly what this means. So far, it's just a bunch of words, and the Zohar, obviously deep ideas, right? But that's what we're getting towards, going to right now. When we say the Shema twice a day, we start with the Shema and then we say Baruch Shem. But in Kislev, we reverse the order, at least conceptually. Instead, the first 24 days of Kislev correspond to Baruch Shem, and they lead to the 25th day, which corresponds to the Shema itself. So the 24 days of Kislev correspond to Baruch Shem Kavod, that's coming first. That builds up towards the Shema, which makes a lot of sense given what we're saying right now. And that's what I said next. It makes sense. Each verse is considered a yichud, which causes and proclaims the unity of God. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Shem Echad. That's talking about the yichud of Hashem, the oneness of God, and also Baruch Shem Kavod Machuso Le'olam Ve'ed is also another yichud. It's another way of proclaiming God's oneness and His mastery over all the world. So they're both called yichudim. The word yichud to unify the reality of Hashem. So. Each verse is which causes and proclaims the unity of God, but with a very significant difference. The Shema is the yichud of Alma De'ila'ah, the upper world of angels, and spiritual purity. And Baruch Shem Kavod Machuso Ve'ed is the yichud of Alma Tita'ah, the lower spiritual murky world of man. In other words, the Shema corresponds to the level of clarity of God's oneness up amongst the angels. They have no shilas, no questions. There's no need to have to explain or look for evidence of God's existence. The angels know 100%. That's the clarity of the Shema. Baruch Shem Kavod corresponds to the world in which we live in, and there people have doubts, and even the people don't believe fully as much as they're supposed to. So these are the two psukim. So this is why, if you subtract the gematria of the first verse of Shema, right, which has a gematria of 1,118, from the gematria of the second verse of Baruch Shem Kavod, which is 1,358, you are left with 240. The gematria of Amalek and the Hebrew word Safek, which means doubt, which is a really remarkable gematria. if you think about it, because it's not just it's so meaningful. It means so much that it should work out that way. It's not so often that gematrias are so perfectly clear, numerically and conceptually like this, without any type of crutching going on. It is the intellectual and spiritual doubt that resulted from eating from the Eitz Hadas Tova that transformed the world of man from one of angels to what it is today. Remove Amalek or Suffolk from the equation, and we return to the level of the clarity of the Shema, which is what's going to happen in Yom HaMashiach. That's what Yom HaMashiach is. Bayamuhu Yeshav Echad Shema Echad. That's what we say every day in Aleinu. That on that day God will become one. He'll become the king over the entire world. Everybody will acknowledge the reality of God. There'll be no doubts in the existence of God or Ashgacha Pratis whatsoever, because we'll go back to the clarity of the Shema. That's what we're working towards. That is the goal, therefore, of the 24 days of Kislev, beginning tonight, right? To get to the level of the Shema, which is 25 letters, by the 25th day of the month, and Baruch Shem is the key. It is the level of the Or HaGanuz, the light which God created on the first day of creation, and subsequently hid from the evil of history, as it says in the pasuk, right? God saw the light that it was good, and God separated between the light and the darkness. Rashi explains, bringing the Gemara, he saw that the wicked were unworthy of using it, and therefore set it apart for the righteous in the future time. The primordial light is also associated with the number 25, and it is said to be hidden in the Ner Chanukah. As it says, Rabbi Yisachar points out, he says that the original light of creation was hidden in the 36 candles of Chanukah. What does it mean? Where? You look inside the candles, you see beautiful glass jars with oil inside, Shem Hazayis, and a flame burning, but where inside is the Or HaGanuz? Shabbos also has Or HaGanuz. That's why there's a sense of Olam Haba on Shabbos if you keep it properly. But Shabbos we can understand. Shabbos is an extremely mystical experience. Likewise, the 36 tractates of the Talmud Bavli is also associated with the Or HaGanuz. Again, we can understand it because it's so complex and so deep and so profound, and we can see that. But where in these little jars is the Or HaGanuz? That what to talk about, B'ezras Hashem. So the question is, what does it mean that the first 24 days of Kislev correspond to the 24 letters of Baruch Shem? How does that work out? In total, or literally letter by letter, so that the first day of Kislev corresponds to the base of Baruch, the second to Reish, etc. No one says, which makes it difficult to use the 24 days in any specific way to prepare for Chanukah, other than cleaning for your Chanukah and buying your wicks of oil. That is what millions of Jews have done now for millennia. What follows is based upon the other approach, starting with the base of Baruch on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and ending with the Dalet of Vav on the 24th day of the month. At the very least, this will help a person to prepare for Chanukah and greatly enhance their appreciation of the key to the final redemption. That's the introduction to the idea. Now we'll start B'ezras Hashem with the letters themselves. Okay, base, right? Baruch Shem, the first letter is a base. The Torah begins with the base of Bereshis. Why not Aleph? I mean, Aleph is the first letter of the Aleph base. Aleph corresponds to Hashem. It would make sense you should begin with an Aleph. The Medrash talks about this. Many Meforshim have asked this question. There are different answers given, such as just as the letter base is closed to what preceded it, but open to what comes after it, likewise, a person should not investigate what preceded creation, but only what came after it. That's the classical answer given, meaning that whatever happened up until creation, that's God's business. We don't have any no right to go looking at that. It's a waste of time. Most people consider it to be, basically, but the reality is it's not accurate at all. That's really what Kabbalah does discuss specifically, and even the idea of being hidden is also misunderstood once you look at the Gra and other Meforshim explaining. But we know so much what's going on prior to creation, so that's, even though that pshat is a medrash and it obviously stands, you have to understand on a deeper level what it actually means. Another answer is more technical. The Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, is exactly that, infinite. right? Everything begins and exists because of God's infinite light, called Or Ein Sof, the light without end. That means sublime, uniform light in every direction, infinitely, which means no boundaries or levels. On such a level, only the light can exist without any possibility of something else existing. In other words, as long as there was only Or Ein Sof, that's the way everything began, the reason it speaks about, as long as that light was unfiltered and left in its original state, nothing else could exist but that light. Plain and simple, right? But that was not what God had in mind. God wanted man to exist and to even have free will, which required a world, right? And many creations and tremendous diversity so that both good and evil could exist. It's still all Or Ein Sof, but after it has been constricted and divided countless times, resulting in what Kabbalah calls Olam Perud, world of separation. In other words, the light began completely spiritual, beyond comprehension. We have no light that we can see or relate to understand what that means, and yet here we are in this very, very physical world. Somehow we went from ayin to yesh, from nothing to something, and that's all what Kabbalah discusses, the idea of spheres and partsufim, how the actual mechanism, the process that Hashem used to make this world, but that's where we are. We're now in a world of Perud, meaning everything, look around you, everything is distinguished, one thing from the other thing. That's the light being broken up and filtered down, right? So the letter base represents this transformation, which is why it is the first letter of Baruch. The concept of a brucha is to increase the flow of divine light into our world so that something good can become even better. This is why a flowing stream is called the brecha. That's what same word from the word brocha. This, or really the other way around as well. The brocha is a flow of light from Shemaim down to us. This is what Chanukah taps into. The Mesiras Nefesh, the self-sacrifice of the Chashmonaim, who fought for God and Torah, elevated additional holy sparks. This triggered zivugim, pairing the spheres, that resulted in a downward flow of light, empowering the Jewish army to defeat the overwhelming, favored Greek army. How does it happen? And we talk about miracles, right? What is it? Miracles just like a poof? Hashem just wills? Yeah, well, that is essentially what a miracle is. But there is a mechanism, there is a system that Hashem uses and He employs that we can actually trigger. We can cause miracles to happen based upon the things that we choose to do and how we live our lives and the will that we put into things and the self-sacrifice. These are things that automatically, naturally speaking, trigger the light to come down. It wasn't just any light that the Chashmonaim drew down. The greater the sacrifice for Torah, the higher up the sparks reach in the spheres, and the higher the level of light that gets drawn down. Right? It's like the thing at the amusement park. You hit it, down here, and it sends up, this thing to hit the bell at the top. Right? Likewise, when we do mitzvahs and we're self-sacrificing for Torah and for God and the right thing, so we elevate sparks. They come from the world below. They go up to Shemayim. That triggers a return of light. A person davens for some situation, they want to improve the situation, health or whatever the case might be. So what they're basically doing is that they're sending up sparks. The tefillah itself, and the stronger the tefillah, the more kavana you put into the tefillah, the higher it goes, and the more sparks you elevate, because that's really the fuel that you're drawing on. The same way if you drive a car, it requires gasoline. You drive the car today. You have battery powered cars, but the same idea. It has some source of fuel. You're using up the fuel to get the movement. Likewise, if a person does something in this world, by definition, they need energy. The energy comes from the tzaddik kedusha, holy sparks. So the more holy sparks you draw out into the world because of what you're doing, and you don't use as many sparks, or you might use a lot of sparks for evil things too, but they can't go to Shemayim in their existing state. If someone does an Avera, it also uses holy sparks. The trouble is that it dirties them, and they can't go to Shemayim that way. So either the person has to be punished, in order to cleanse the spark so they can go up to Shemayim, or the person does tshuva, which is the better way to do it, and that cleanses the sparks, and then they can go back up to Shemayim. But either the way that the sparks have to go up to Shemayim, and once they do, so then that triggers a flow of light back down in the form of the brucha that you're asking for. So that's why it's so important to daven or to do a mitzvah and have as much kavanah as possible, because the kavanah acts in a sense like a booster rocket. Words have only so much power to penetrate the upper worlds and to bring the light back down. But the kavanah is like that booster rocket that sends it even further higher up towards Hashem, so therefore the success rate is going to be much greater. So in this case, it was the Or HaGenuz itself, the hidden light of creation that God created, the miraculous light that God hid on the first day, which resulted in a supernatural reality, and most important of all, greater revelation of God to mankind. Now, I'm not reading the footnotes here, because there are quite a few of them, but the book does have a lot, so some things that are not being explained right now are in fact explained in the footnotes, but it'd take too long to go through all of that. It is interesting that the mitzvah is not to light the menorah inside the house like we do Shabbos candles. Right? Shabbos candles we do inside the house because we want the light for the Shabbos Suda and for getting it around. Right? The mitzvah of lighting near Chanukah everywhere in the world, just that in Chutz La'aretz it might be dangerous, so people light them inside. But in Eretz Yisrael, it is one of the most wonderful things to see the glow of the light in the streets against the stone walls. Because of mitzvah persuminisa, of revealing the miracle to the world, to ourselves and the world around us. That's why we're lighting the menorah for everyone to see, right? But outside, in front of the house, just as the letter Aleph precedes the letter Beis, which is spelled the same as Bayis, house. This indicates that the miracle of Chanukah was not of this world, to which the Beis refers, but of the world of Aleph that preceded and gave rise to it, which is the world of the Or HaGenuz. In other words, the fact that we're lighting the house itself is a bias, is a base, right? So it corresponds to the base, right? We're lighting the menorah outside, in front of the house, the same with the Aleph, which corresponds to Kabbalah, is outside or before the base. So it's another way of indicating that this is to do with the Or HaGenuz, and the miracle of Chanukah, and the story of Chanukah is rooted in a much more miraculous spiritual reality, which is why it's 8 days long, because 8 is always the number that represents the spiritual world. So this is why we light 36 candles over the 8 days of Chanukah, which the Or HaGenuz is said to be hidden. 36 is a number that indicates a revelation of Or HaGenuz has occurred, revealing the Shechina, the divine presence. Once the Or HaGenuz was hidden after illuminating the world for 36 hours in the Garden of Eden, the 12 hours of Erev Shabbos, the 24 hours of Shabbos itself. Kislev is comprised of two parts, a chof and a samach, the word for cover, and lamed vav, which is a gematria 36. Chanukah celebrates the revelation of the supernal light of creation that, until the 25th of Kislev, remains hidden in the world, in creation itself. If the first 24 days of Kislev are used well, then a person becomes a fitting kli, vessel for the light of the Messianic era that breaks into our world for 8 days, as it says, he made a separation in the illumination of the light. This is the Leshem speaking. He's explaining Rashi. Rashi only brings the Gemara, and the Gemara indicates, or seems to indicate, that the light was hidden at the beginning of history and will not be revealed again until well after, in the Messianic era onward and in the world to come, not in this world at all whatsoever. So therefore, what's the point? And how can we say we're accessing it? So Kabbalah explains that the main light will not be revealed again until 6,000 onward. But a tamsis, a fraction, a portion of the light does remain available to man, and as small as that may sound, it is absolutely overwhelming for us. We can never handle the full light at this time, which is one of the reasons why God doesn't give it to us. We couldn't live. Moshe says to God, show me your face, right? Show me your glory. And God says, no man can see my face and live. That's what God's saying. You're asking for a revelation of a light that your body cannot hold, cannot handle. So therefore, I'll give you a sample. So therefore, God passed by. Moshe was in the cleft of the rock. This is all symbolic of the fact that the light is filtered down and we're getting a tamsis, a smaller amount of it. But that smaller amount for us is overwhelming. And this is what Chanukah accesses through the mitzvah of light the menorah. So the lesson goes on to explain, right, that the actual hiding was that, well, he says, that it should not flow or give off light except for the righteous, whose actions draw it down and give off light. The actions of the evil, however, block it, which leaves them in spiritual darkness. This itself was the hiding of the light. In other words, what it's saying basically is that the light itself knows, or it's built into creation, or Hashem controls it, of course, right? That it only flows to somebody who's a fitting container. The Gemara says that God looked down into history when he made this primordial light back at the beginning, in the first day of creation, and he said that the evil will abuse it. They'll use it the wrong way. So I'm not going to allow it to be abused. Sun, the moon, the stars, incandescent lighting, fluorescent lighting, LED lighting, all of that basically can be used by anybody. Nobody asks the question, are you good or are you bad? It's available to everybody. But the Oreganu is not, because that's a very special, primordial, holy light. So God made it, even after he hid it, that this light will flow down to people who are a fitting container for the light. In other words, it's like a glass of water. Right? Water is the ikr. There's no question about that. But without the glass, you can't drink. You can, but it's not the same thing. So even though the glass is just a kli, it's what holds the water and allows you to drink. The same thing with your body and your soul. There's no question that your soul is holier and more important than your body. It's the essence of who you are. But without your body, the soul has no way to reveal itself, no way to accomplish anything. But the soul can't go just into any body. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why Mashiach hasn't come yet, because the container necessary to hold the light of Mashiach, which is, the person himself can be in the world. Somebody today in the world, more than likely, is going to be Mashiach, sitting in the base measure somewhere. He might be in his 70s, might be in his 80s. Who knows? We don't know the details of such a person, but they're so holy and they're so spiritual that if Hashem were to put the light of Mashiach into them, instantly, like Moshe Rabbeinu, right? It gets yay to the Shema. They would become Mashiach. In the meantime, Hashem hasn't put that light into them, which is why he hasn't come. But in order for him to receive that light, he has to first perfect himself spiritually, become a fitting kli and container. All of us go through whatever suffering we go through in life as part of that process. That's what we're doing every day. That's what Torah and mitzvahs are all about. Preparing the kli, right? As the kli is what is, has to be. There's the Gemara basically that Hanan ibn, I forget the last name, but he was asked by the daughter of Caesar, who happened to see him, and apparently he was not a very attractive person, but she knew he was a Talmid Chacham, and she's such a beautiful wisdom in such an ugly container. So why would God do that? So he said to her, "What does your father keep his wine in?" And she said, "Well, earthenware vessels, containers, kli chayres." He says, "Everybody does that. The poor, they do it as well like that. Why don't your father's the king? He should be put into gold and silver, things like that." So she told her father. Her father said, "Fine," and they put it in gold and silver. Then he asked for some wine later on. He drank the wine. Of course, it was putrid. It was terrible. So he said, "Why is this wine so bad?" And they said, "Sire, you put it into gold and silver. The wine's going to start to, become, destroyed." And so he said to his daughter, "Why did you tell me to do that?" And she said, "Well, this rabbi told me to tell you to do that." So he asked "Why did you tell my daughter to do that?" He said, "I was making a point. I was making a point, right? That even though the gold and silver containers are beautiful, wine, which happens to represent das, which we'll talk about as Hashem, right? That is something that can only go into a humble container, which kli cheres, clay vessels, they represent that because they're not pompous like valuable metals. So he's saying that you see the same way that the das, which is the wine, had to be kept in, so to speak, humble containers to maintain its integrity. Likewise, because Baruch Hu put into me, not a handsome person, because he knows that I won't become arrogant, and I'll use the Torah the proper way. because I can't think highly of myself. I'm not going to start parading myself. So the only thing I really that's important is my Torah itself. And that's the point he was making. And that's the whole idea. The idea of becoming a kli for the light. So that's what the base starts off teaching us to do. Okay, the next letter is the resh, right? The resh says with the following thing. The word brocha is an interesting word. If you take out the vav, you're left with base resh chof, right? We spoke about brocha. The base is the first letter of brocha, but if you take out the word brocha itself, baruch, you take the word baruch, you take out the vav inside of it, so you have, right, baruch is, is also brocha, right? So you have base resh chof, which means bless, and whose numbers are 2, that's the base, 200, which is the resh, and 20, which is the chaf, or chasafit in this case, right? Respectively. All multiples of 2. In gematria, multiplications of numbers, right, refers to the concept on a higher level of spheres. The same 3 letters also spell the word bechor, firstborn, when the cholam vowel is only a dot over the resh. The bechor usually receives double the inheritance of the rest of the son than the rest of the sons from the father. Again, the idea of planting a brucha. Thus, like the letter base, the resh is bound up with the concept of more. Perhaps this is why it is the first letter of Rasha, an evil person, right, as in the Haggadah. One of the main driving forces of a Rasha to perpetrate evil is an unquenchable desire to have more. The easier, the better, especially in the case of Esav of Rasha. So Yaakov says, right, to Esav in Parshas V'yishlach, now take my gift, which has been brought to you, for God has favored me with it, and because I have everything. He prevailed upon him, and he took it. I have everything, Yaakov says, all my necessities. However, Rashi explains, Esav spoke haughtily. I have plenty, meaning much more than I need. So that's the idea. Like, they look at the world, billions upon billions of dollars, and people want more power and more control, more. That's the whole world. The whole world of materials is all about having more. The idea of being samech bechalko, content with your portion, is a very difficult concept for a lot of people, especially in a world with so much competition, and now with technology making so much more available to so many more people at affordable prices. It's just like a race to have as much as possible. Another car, a fancier house, always more, right? In terms of gashmis. When it comes to ruchnis, you can't have enough. When it comes to gashmis, you have to have enough. Otherwise, as the Gemara says, it's very hard to eat at 2 tables at the same time. Either you're going to pursue materialism at the cost of spirituality, or vice versa. So, but that did not stop But did that stop Asa from taking more? Did it stop Rome from expanding its empire? Did it stop Hitler, Yamach Shmo v'Zichrov, from stretching his army and resources and risking eventual military loss? The evil can be mighty and powerful for a time, and even do a lot of damage. But in the end, the very greed that made them so successful will also ultimately be the source of their own downfall, like Haman, for example. And the very spiritual material contentment that Yaakov Avinu showed, and which drives the tzaddikim of history, becomes the basis of their eternal survival. Being happy with one's portion doesn't only save a person from sin for the sake of the world to come, it also brings an inner contentment in this world as well, preventing a person from being caught up in the world of more, that most of mankind lives in and stresses about. The letter Resh is also the first letter of the word Rosh, which means head or leader. The Gemara says, Onkelos bar Kalonikos, the son of Titus' sister, wanted to convert to Judaism. He went and raised Titus from the grave through necromancy and sent to him, who is most important in that world where you are now? Titus answered him, the Jewish people. Onkelos asked him, should I join them here in this world? Titus told him, their commandments are numerous, and you will not be able to fulfill them. It is better to go and battle against them in this world, and you'll become the head. As it says, her adversaries have become the head, from Eicha. which means that anyone who troubles the Jewish people will become their head, to become leaders of the army. What's that supposed to mean? That's like inviting the enemies of the Jewish people to attack them with God's blessing and promise of success. In fact, there is an earlier story that seems to say exactly this. The Romans then sent Nero Caesar against the Jews. When he came to Jerusalem, he wanted to see his chances of success, so he shot an arrow to the east, and it fell in Jerusalem. He shot another arrow to the west, and it fell in Jerusalem. He shot an arrow in all four directions. I'm not sure why four, because the one going towards Jerusalem for sure is going to go to Jerusalem, unless it would somehow go somewhere else, in which case it would mean something else. But that's what it says, okay? And each time the arrow fell in Jerusalem. He then did another test, and he asked the child, "Tell me a verse that you learned today." The child answered him, and he passed from Yechezkel, "And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel." Nero said, "Clearly, the Holy One, blessed is he, plans to destroy his temple and wants to wipe his hands with that man who destroys it," meaning me. If I'm going to go do it and I'm going to be successful, like I'm being encouraged to do right now, then I'm going to be blamed for it later on. But in the meantime, I will be successful. I will be successful. I'll be able to do it and destroy the Beis Hamikdash. If you were a Roman and you were told this, what would you do next? Right? Attack, for sure. The Romans always looked for signs of success before going to battle. And what better sign was there than God himself foretelling a victory? Certainly the last thing a Roman should have done at that point was join the Jews, as the Gemara says Nero Caesar did. And the question is why? You know, you're being told that the people you're about to attack, somebody's going to conquer them. They're going to be, destroyed more or less in the upcoming months. And you go ahead and convert and join them? Why would you do a thing like that? Because both Onkelos and Nero were smart enough to realize that if God was prepared to allow his people to become so downtrodden in this limited temporal world, it must be because it would be so elevated in the next eternal world. And they were right. As the Gemara says, Rabbi Yeshua's son became weak and his soul left him. When he recovered, his father asked him, "What'd you see?" In a near-death experience. He died, went to the next world, saw something, and then came back, right? He answered him, "An upside-down world. That's what I saw. There, whoever is esteemed here was down, right? And those who are down here were esteemed there, were held in high esteem there." He told his son, "My son, you saw a clear world, not an upside-down world. You saw the world the way it's supposed to be, not the way you're used to." This is what the Reish instructs. It's not about being ahead in this world, but in the next one. If you have to lead, do it because divine providence has sent you, and not so that you could have more of something in this world. That's the Reish. Vav. That's the next letter, base Reish Vav. The letter Vav has many important aspects. Like Das, which is godly knowledge, right? Das literally is knowledge itself, but in this case, it refers to that type of wisdom, the knowledge of what life is about according to God and how best to use it to accomplish the purpose of creation on the highest levels. And that's what we're struggling with all the time in everyday life. So it has, like Das, the Vav itself has a power to connect something and to unify, being a conjunction. In other words, the Vav itself is like the word bat, right? It's always joining something else. It corresponds to the sphere of Yesod, which is associated with Yosef Tzaddik, the conduit through which God fed Egypt and Yaakov's family during the famine. Therefore, the letter of Vav is also associated with Geula, redemption, which was destined to come during the 6th millennium, which also corresponds to Yesod and the Vav. It is Mashiach ben Yosef, a descendant of Yosef, who will initiate the redemption process. The Vav not only connects thoughts, but worlds. The curtains of the Mishkan hung from hooks. The Mishkan was the actual building inside. Then you had the Olam Moed, the Temple of Meeting, which is all around a big huge temple. Inside you have the Chatzar, the courtyard where the altar was and the sacrifices took place. And around this huge area was a curtain that blocked the view from the outside to separate from the holy and the profane. And it hung from hooks, and the hooks themselves were called vavim, right? So from hooks called vavim, the worlds of Atzilus, Beria, and Yesira, the higher spiritual worlds, were on the inside, and the everyday will of Asiya was on the outside. There are diagrams to explain this. This is a little abstract right now, but the concept, basically the idea that vavim connect to the outside world. The vavim that's holding the curtains up, even though there was a separation of the curtain, in a sense, they connected the spiritual world on the inside of the Mishkan with the everyday world on the outside. They were the connecting piece, just like between two words, right? You have a vav to connect the two words of thoughts. Likewise, the vav holding up the curtains also connected the two worlds. So it is a vav that connects the upper yud to the lower yud to create the letter aleph. And in aleph, you have a yud on top, you have the vav between, and then you have a yud below, right, to make the aleph, which stands for God, one, and has a gematria of yud ke vav ke. The aleph is everything, and points to Shemaim. We'll get to that, but the basic concept is that the vav is connecting the two worlds, because the yud on top, I'll explain it right now, right? The two yuds, the upper one and the lower one, correspond to two chachmas. The upper chachma, on the level of Shema Yisrael, the angelic clarity of God, and the lower chachma, ma'achus, the level of Baruch Shem Kavod, and the world of man. So you have the aleph, you have the vav between, you have the yud on top, that corresponds to the world of the angels, Shemaim, heaven. And then you have the yud below in the aleph, which corresponds to our world. The aleph itself represents both worlds. What connects them? The letter vav. The vav itself is connecting the upper world with the lower world. Similarly, the sulam, the ladder in Yaakov's dream, was the vav that joins heaven and earth. That's what a ladder looks like. It's a long, thin, tall thing that is a vav, in essence, and it connected Shemaim and earth in the dream, right? Zerampi, which connects to the Bina of the Malchus. When the Torah says it is not in heaven that you say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us, to tell it to us so we can fill it, Rashi explains it's not in heaven, because if it was in heaven, you'd have to climb up after it in order to learn it. It's talking later on Parashat Nitzavim, when God is telling us to choose life that we may live, that we should learn Torah, and he emphasizes the fact that it's not far away. If Torah was in Shemayim, you still have to go get it, but you don't have to. It's down here on earth. If it was across the sea, you'd still have to go get it, but you don't have to. It's right next to you. How would you do it? I mean, it's fine. It's like a metaphor. It's an idea emphasizing the need to learn Torah and how our obligation extends to a certain extent, right? But they're still left with the question, how do we do that? How do we go into Shemayim to get it? Well, that's what Pardes is about, and that's what the Vav comes to teach us about. It means this: by accumulating das, one climbs the ladder from heaven to earth, from a lower level of spiritual consciousness to a higher one from which Torah came. The Vav also can travel time, in a sense, connecting past to future, or future to past. A Vav at the beginning of a word can change it from future tense to past tense. For example, the word Yomar means, and he will say. With a Vav before the Yud, the word instead means, and he said. So just the Vav alone changes the exact same word into a different tense. And if Yaakov had had his way, the first letter of Baruch Shem would not be a vase, as we mentioned before. He wanted to give Baruch Shem 25 letters, just like the Shema, for very deep reasons. Which letter was missing? If you look at the words Baruch Shem Kavod, right, every letter is there. So what are you going to add? So the only thing that he could add would be a Vav in front of the base of Baruch Shem. So then we would say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, U Baruch Shem Kavod, Machuso Le'olam Ve'ed. Not heroes of the Lord, and then Baruch Shem. It would be a continuation, meaning that the clarity of the unity of God that the angels have, it's down here too. We will have it as well. And probably in Yom Mashiach, That's what's going to happen. Probably we'll add the Vav to Baruch Shem Kavod, and we'll say Shema Yisrael uBaruch Shem Kavod Machveh, because now the worlds will be connected on the same level of intellectual and spiritual clarity. But as the following testifies, it wasn't, at least not yet, possible. And we see it from when Yaakov, in fact, questioned his son, the 12 tribes, about their level of Yichud Hashem. The Torah says that Yaakov, in Parashat V'chi, before he died, he wanted to reveal to his sons the end of days. And then the prophet, he left them. The Torah doesn't explain why. It barely says anything. It just goes to the next topic. The Gemara asks the question. The Gemara says, why is it that Yaakov, in fact, lost the prophecy? So the Gemara goes into more detail, the conversation behind the conversation, and says the following thing. Yaakov said, perhaps, God forbid, there is something unfit from my bed, just as Yishmael was born to Abraham and Esau to my father Yitzchak. And it says, giving birth to a son, that is literally becomes the enemy of the Jewish people. And it's a pagam of Abraham to some degree. It's a pagam of Yitzchak. Maybe I have the same problem. I have 12 sons. I thought you're all kosher, you're all tzaddikim. Maybe someone's not. And that's why the prophecy was left, and that's why God took it away from me, right? But his sons answered back, and they said, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, meaning just as in your heart there's only one, so too in our hearts there's only one. So the brothers are answering back and saying, by saying the Shema, no, don't worry, we worked it all out. We understand now that God is the only one. When we sold Yosef, we were unclear about. I mean, we knew it was true, but it wasn't real to us. But now it's real to us. Yaakov says, I don't think so. And we see this, by the way, because later on, when it come after Yaakov dies, the brothers come to Yosef and say to him, "Our father told us to tell you not to harm us, be a messenger, right?" And Yosef knows that's not true. And so he says, "Tachas and Elokim Anochi, am I in place of God? Didn't you learn anything from all of this? Is God still some distant reality to you? But like when you sold me back in Shechem, now we're in big trouble. Now comes the Egyptian exile." So that's what it says. At the time, Yaakov said, Baruch Shem Kavod Machsim, meaning he didn't put the vav there, meaning, yeah, close, but not quite. Still work to do. So the Zohar explains and adds, Yaakov had wanted to rectify the Malchus below, so the lower unity, and establish the unity of the 24 letters, which is Baruch Shem Kavod, right? He did not complete it with 25 letters because the Mishkan needed to be built. That level of unity of God's name was not achieved until much later, when the mission was finally completed at Har Sinai on the 25th day of Kislev. So, what we see and we get from this is that the Vav itself represents the continuity of that clarity of God's existence that the angels have applied in our world. A person has it for themselves. Mankind will have it in the Messianic era. We had it in the Mishkan, because in the Mishkan, miracles took place, the service of God. It was very hard to deny the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be in any doubt about it, because it's right in front of us the entire time. So that, in that respect, Baruch Shem Kavod became fulfilled, and the Zohar says that's why the first pasuk of Yikra, after it says V'yikra Shem Moshe, has 25 letters to allude to the 25 letters that Baruch Shem Kavod was supposed to have. So the Vav, therefore, is hugely important in terms of Geula, in terms of personal rectification, in terms of connecting the upper world with the lower world, because without it, it's not the same reality. And that's what Chanukah comes to help us with, to restore. It's what happened with the Chashbanaim in their time. In the sense that they did the miracle of Chanukah, and the menorah reminds us of this, and B'ezras Hashem, we should be zeichet to reach such a level, and we'll continue on B'ezras Hashem later on. Shabbat Shalom, good Chodesh, and we'll speak B'ezras Hashem.